without any further ado, I'm going to ask David to really just start us off talking about Act 46 and setting the stage for today. Thanks.
Sure. Emily, thank you so much for helping sort of moderate and facilitate all of this, and everyone for joining. Please know that also if you either have a question that doesn't end up getting addressed or a comment that you feel I need to hear and time constraints run out, just reach out to me at the campaign info@zuckermanforvt.com, and I'll make sure to get back to you because sometimes there's more than we can fit in an hour. I just want to start by, as I always do in my political role, just being really clear about ownership of what I have done, where I'm at, and what I thought the intent was of the bill. So I did serve on the Education Committee when Act 46 was written. I was in the Senate at that time. I'd been in the House prior to that for 14 years. And there had been on and off conversations about how do we address the sometimes rhetorically stated, huge expense of schools. And there's this constant push me, pull you in politics around schools are too much money and education spending is too high and taxes are too high. And yet the vast majority of communities, of course, pass their school budgets because our communities really do, on average, more so than not, support their schools and the community schools that they are and what they mean in communities in terms of family and events, and often they are the center of many communities along with town meeting day. But there's often been pressure to say, well, spending in schools and education is too high. And there's not a lot of detail about why is that or what drives that. And there was a conversation to say there's at times expenses in overhead that maybe we could save if some of these business managers and or teachers that were working in 2 or 3 different districts often would then leave and only stay for a couple of years, so there was turnover. What were the ways to help make it so that districts could have less overhead with all the rules and laws that the state and federal government and courts are putting onto schools, and ways to let teachers stay in a given area for a more consistent amount of time for a more smoother education across the board. So I was on the committee education as we passed Act 46 with the administration coming in regularly to talk about what the process would be, with other folks like Marty Strange concerned about how this kind of law, similar to what happened in Maine, would lead to closing of schools. And what I thought we did was to put in, as many of you may know, the alternative structures language. We call it for short the off-ramp, for the ability for districts, so long as they did certain things, to be able to petition to remain as individual districts and not be forced into a merger. And I don't think I have to go into a lot of that detail with this crowd. You probably know about the alternative structures concept in the bill with respect to reasonable expenses and reasonable outcomes for kids and challenges with merging either because of operational structure or geographic distance and so forth. So the idea was, if you then looked for other districts to merge with from an administrative perspective and it wasn't going to work, then you could apply for alternative structure. What then happened as the administration administered the bill seems to have varied from that intent. We thought 25 to 35, maybe even as many as 40 districts would qualify because of those various criteria being met. And this administration and the State Board of Education, from what I've heard over time, first put forth everybody's got a merge plan in one way or another, pretty much, and that the State Board of Education, maybe partly because they were overwhelmed, I don't know, really didn't give the alternative proposals airtime and the opportunity to present. It seemed, from what I heard from some of the folks, maybe on this call and others, that hard work was put into those proposals and folks were given like 15 minutes to make your points, and then it was up or down. If I'm missing anything, by the way, we can chime in or let Emily know, Representative Kornheiser. So that was what I thought was going to happen, as I don't recall if I presented some of the bill, but I did support the presentation of the bill because we thought, and a number of people voted for the bill from areas of the state that were going to be impacted, as we thought, administratively, but we didn't think were going to have as many forced situations as occurred, particularly some in the kingdom, some down in the southern Windham County area, and along the west side in the southern part of the state, where a lot of different situations have really created a lot of angst. And just so you know, right next to my area, what prompted this was a woman who had been on the school board in Ripton was concerned because the district of Middlebury, with 7 other towns around it, when the contract was written up, there was no ability for towns to protect their school. And the final thing I'll sort of close with before we do a little more other conversation was that I thought, we did look at whether individual towns would always get a vote and a voice on the new district board, and that there could be language that would say no school could be closed unless it was a unanimous vote of the board. And that would have given every original smaller district sort of a veto power. We learned that wasn't allowed under one person, one vote, because again, each town had different numbers of people, so you'd be disproportionately giving them a louder voice relative to their population on the combined district. But what I learned was that many districts drew up language in their contracts that said no school could be closed unless the voters in that respective town or geographical area voted to do so. And some new merged districts did not include that language. And I can just say, as someone, if I had been governor and put advisors out there to help districts, that is language I would have suggested in every contract, because that would have saved Lincoln or Ripton from having their school closed. That would have saved some other towns on this call, or people from some of those towns, that opportunity. So that's my understanding of what happened and where we are today. And part of this conversation is going to be both hearing from you if I've mischaracterized something or there's something you want to add, and also move into, well, what do we do going forward to make sure where it's not working right, are there possibilities to make it work better?
So looking for folks who want to contribute around the idea of places where the intent wasn't followed, or anything you'd like to add to that piece of the conversation. I hear from Barbara that in Orwell, they fought the merger for a long time, but in the end they gave it because they thought they would lose their small school grant, but it turns out that wasn't true. So certainly some misinformation was moving around. Jody, I see your hand up. Do you want to add something?
You'll need to unmute, Jody, sorry.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, there you go.
First of all, I'm from Dummerston, which is part of the southern Vermont. We all voted overwhelmingly not to merge in large groups. And our vote was not respected. And I heard you yesterday say you're going around the state for democracy. And I'd like to know what you can do about that. We were part of a group. We did do an alternative governance structure. We worked hard. All of us down here worked on it. Brattleboro was right with us all the way. And that's the big, elephant in the room down here. And it was not even, we didn't even see the Secretary of Ed. We only saw Donna Russo Savage. They gave us the 15 minutes. We went, the State Board of Ed voted, I think 7-2 with John Carroll and Bill Mathis on our side because we're small communities. And we did not want to merge. Fortunately, we have a school board of good people now. I think most of them were anti-merger. But that doesn't make me feel any better, because we could any day get someone on that board or people on the board who would try to force us to merge, to give up our schools, even though we do have a clause in there that said we would have to vote. I'm not sure how strong that is. And the other thing I wanted to say to you is that when this was going on, David, I spoke to you and communicated with you several times, and you were for this Act 46.
Yeah.
So I'm liking to hear you say that there are problems, and I'd like something to be done about it, because I come from a place where all of our schools were excellent. They all followed the 5 things that they needed to follow, and that was not even considered once. So thank you.
Well,
David,
sure. And
David,
okay,
before
go
you
ahead.
jump in, I'm sorry. Just want to encourage the other people whose hands are up to please add their questions and comments into the chat, because I think we're only going to have a chance to hear from Jody's voice. And then for the other folks, we need you to add your names to the chat. So David, I'm sorry. We're talking about the votes being respected. Jump back.
Right. So a couple things. As I said then, and even now, I think the concept of Act 46 was a good concept. I just don't think it was quite implemented the way that it was intended to be implemented. In that, districts that met those criteria there should have been more variances given. So the question now for me is, because that didn't happen, what do we do going forward to either, if it's truly not working, allow districts to break up? That would be the far end of what I would like to see happen, because I do think if it can work, and if there are administrative savings, and one of the things that's sort of a misnomer out there was that people said, well, the point of administrative savings was to lower taxes. And that's not entirely true. The conversation was, if we can be more efficient on the administrative side of education, then we can either, as a local district would choose to do, hold taxes in line or expand educational opportunities. Now, there's other educational opportunity expansion possibilities, including more virtual opportunities if we had better broadband everywhere, and or at least in the schools where you could have a teacher teaching a course in 3 different schools at once around particular science opportunities or others. Because sometimes in some of the smaller schools, there just weren't as many teachers and opportunities to have the range of classes that some districts had. So with respect to democracy, one of the issues, and this may or may not be well received, and you all can give me some feedback, is that because the spending formula and the funding formula for schools is now no longer you and your town fund your school solely, but we're part of this broader system that has ultimately provided more funding for most towns in Vermont than they would have otherwise have been able to raise with the tax rates that they have right now, that folks in those other parts of the state felt everyone should have a little bit of a say in how to contain some of those expenses. So we have to be aware that there's a tension there of, okay, if folks really want to have their own district be in charge of everything, would they really want to pay the tax rates, which constitutionally has been ruled not possible? And we saw, and many of you who maybe were involved with your local schools saw, that the annual budgets were getting harder and harder to figure out how to pass while providing all of the opportunities that you wanted for the kids in your area. And that is a precipice that many small districts in particular were getting closer and closer to. And this was an attempt to say, before some of these small schools close by that method, let's see if we can save money at the administrative level. But there is a loss of some of the pure democracy in that. There's no doubt about it.
So we have a few different questions about closing schools. We have a question about state legislation that possible state legislation that we need to engage with the town and allow towns to vote as whether or not they want to close their school. And then a question about if a school board is unwilling to add that language, even with a petition, what are the options to force the issue? And maybe one of those is legislation.
Yeah, I've been chewing on this a bit, although I'm open to far more ideas. And I just want Lola to know that any idea I throw out is not sort of the David Zuckerman proposal for fixing Act 46 all of a sudden, but that these are conversations, and that ideas from all of you, as well as what I put out there, are to foster creative ideas, because no legislation is made with one person coming up with the answer. In fact, often the first solution is not the final solution, but it helps shape and form where things go. So the state, as many people know, probably more so than you want, has a lot of ability to pressure outcomes. And the state could either create economic incentives for districts to make sure to change their bylaws or their I think they would be called bylaws more than a contract, of the new district to grant every town's voters, or I should say district, because not all schools are exactly the borders of a town, but every district the right to have a veto vote by the community members at a regularly warned, town meeting kind of vote. That if the district were to say, we think this school should close, that town would have the right to vote to say, no, we don't think that should be what happens. There may be a point over time, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, when a town's voters say, you know what, it does make sense. It would be less expensive for us and better for our kids to go to the next towns over elementary school than rebuild our school because of its age. There's a lot of situations where people may at some point in time decide, yeah, maybe it is right. But that should be a decision, at least a veto decision, that could go back to the people of each district.
Thanks. So we have a lot of themes around sort of the unintended consequences or examples where intent wasn't followed. School districts, so schools closing, positions being eliminated, economic hits related to that. And then people are really sort of naturally moving into the next phase of this conversation that we wanted to have, which are ideas for improvement. That's where we're going already. And so one idea for improvement, I think, and Joanna, please correct me if I'm reading this wrong, is H62 and whether or not you would support that. It's a local process I'm not sure if it's supposed to be a successor to Act 46 related to school closures. And I'm personally not familiar with H62, so it might, and it wouldn't be H62 next biennium. So the question is, we might want to call on that person.
Yeah, could you call on that person to help define a little bit?
Yes.
For not everyone's always aware, but there's often 900 to 1,000 bills in the House and 300 to 500 in the Senate. And so when it's just a bill with a number, we often don't know specifically what it is unless it's one that was acted upon and in discussion a lot. So I apologize.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to just throw that number out too. I sometimes get the number wrong, but I believe that it is sitting in the House right now, and it is a town vote before school closure, and it's what's in all the default articles. And so it is a little redundant, but I just was sort of showing that there is legislation waiting to be acted on. And you're definitely right. That next biennium, it'll need to be reintroduced. So that was just my point with that.
Yeah, and it sounds like that bill is very much in line with what I was just talking about, is some way for that to be brought into those articles of incorporation. Now, it's a curious thing, of course, because on the one hand, it's the state then reaching into that local decision that was made, although then the question is, how was the discussion around forming those original bylaws? And different folks, different parts of the state had different contract advisors in it, and it seems like in some places that language was incorporated, in some places it wasn't. I know in the Middlebury district, I think someone commented in the chat, and I'm not reading all of the chats because I'm trying to just focus on the words and they're coming up so fast. I'm trying to focus on the conversation. But in Middlebury, you have 8 prior districts merged into one, and the Middlebury district, original district itself, has more people than the other 7 combined. And so the vote to create the school board itself could often be dominated by the outcome of the individual votes of the voters in Middlebury. I'm very careful not to say the vote of the town of Middlebury, because again, each of these districts is still made up of unique voters. And then the question is, do people vote with a sort of geographic or political boundary in their mindset? So it doesn't automatically mean all the school board members would come from Middlebury and all the thoughts would be Middlebury focused. On the other hand, that does sometimes tend to happen. So that district is one that I know that language from I think you said 62 or 67, is not in the articles. And should the state force that on every district, it certainly should be talked about and figured out, because I do think some of those small towns are just getting railroaded.
So I wonder if next we could hear from Bill Coleman, because Bill is writing about sort of a theme that's coming across in a number of places about a sense of cooperation across towns and really sort of how people perceive our children or voting decisions related to our children. I think that's a big theme around how Act 46 was executed. So Bill, I wonder if you could, you wrote a really eloquent paragraph, and if you could share with us sort of some of your concerns. And you're gonna need to unmute.
Yes, thank you. Well, we do have like a wide range of towns and demographics within those towns in this district, and we're separated by a really large forested area out in Victory and Granby, which isn't even included in the Kingdom East School District. So the town of Lunenburg, for example, is really far away from the town of Newark, where I live. And politically, we're like polar opposites. I was told recently that Newark may be the most left-leaning town in the Northeast Kingdom based on various results, and then various political results. And then I heard that, well, I just know from traveling through Lunenburg that it appears to be just the opposite. It's just an extremely different situation over there without going into details. So there's a lot of resentment against government. Anyway, taxes generally are regarded as quite high here, and sometimes I don't think people are really looking at what the services they're receiving are, but especially I think the resentments run very deep in Lunenburg, and some of the people that live there I think are responsive to some really divisive rhetoric that they sometimes come into contact with. And there are many low-income people who are just drawn to a sense that their taxes are just absolutely unaffordable, particularly in Lunenburg. I think the town I live in is considerably more affluent, but they need to repair their schools over there. I know people that live in Lunenburg, and the Lunenburg school and the Gilman school are just, they need everything from roofs to heating systems. I know that the senior center in Lunenburg closed, so that would be one possibility with merging that into the schools over there.
Bill, what I really appreciated that you said, and I want to open up to some other people here, is how do we, in districts that have merged or that are working on cooperating together now, how do we help foster enough of a sense of community and responsibility for other people when we have a wider geography, so that people are supporting all of our kids or are able to sort of navigate that voting process when it's not necessarily their kids or their neighbors' children, but in fact some other family all the way across town or 2 towns over. I think that's the heart of what, you know, some of what Bill was talking about with the different communities that were stuck together. Does anyone have any ideas on that as we sort of move forward that David could take with him?
And I can offer a little bit, but I want to make sure if
Please.
someone has an idea, you feel you can let Emily know you want to chime in. You know, it's really interesting to me that we end up with historical boundaries of towns that we still fixate on in our minds of this town thinks this way and that town thinks another way. When if you walk out to where the town line is and you actually stand and look out, I'm pretty sure, for instance, the foliage on either side of the mountain from a line that's just a line on a piece of paper doesn't change much, right? And I think this is a challenge we've had over time for many, many centuries as our ability to transportation changes, the distance we can travel. So I think that's part of the conversation here. But the bigger conversation, whether it's Act 60, Act 46, Act 68, all these other pieces, is what is that common value that we have? And I think we do have it in Vermont around the goal of giving a really good education to all of our kids. Now, the definition of good could be different in different people's minds. For me, it's about critical thinking, analytical skills. It's not just facts and memorization. It's actually about thinking and coming to conclusions with the information presented and thinking what isn't presented. But different school districts have moved in different directions with the school boards that are elected, and we rarely hear the conversations I think we need to have around that aspect of what are our schools providing, and how do we make sure kids in every corner of the state get as much opportunity to thrive and succeed as they can. I'll try to be brief with this story, but when I was first elected lieutenant governor, that's the only time when you get sworn in, is the only time as lieutenant governor you get to really give a speech to the Senate, because otherwise you're kind of like a town moderator. You're supposed to be neutral in running the parliamentary procedures. But I gave every single senator an heirloom dry bean seed. Being a farmer, I thought that was kind of a little metaphorical piece. And dry beans, as you know, are big, small, one color, multicolored, speckled, 50-50, all kinds of things. And I said, inside each of these beans is all the genetic potential, just like every seed, to grow and thrive and be productive and just live to their fullest. But the soil that each bean is planted in and the natural environment that it grows in, whether it's a windstorm, a hailstorm, or certain pests or drought or too much rain, is going to impact that ability for the plant and that seed to live to its fullest potential. And my parallel was that's the reality for our kids. Every kid has potential, but depending on the home situation, the community situation, the school situation, the financial situation, the parental situation, everybody has different environments that they're raised in, and that impacts sometimes that full potential. And so for me, I see our schools as being one of the greater equalizers of what government is about, which is to create the best environment for our youth to thrive and succeed. Now, one of the other areas that I think is related to this is where the state government has a role to play, because many of your schools, I think, have seen budgetary pressures because of social service needs for some of the kids in the schools. And what we see is that the state has the Human Services Agency, which I'd like to call the Agency of Human Opportunity rather than Agency of Human Services, so that it's really about helping get people back into their opportunity possibilities. They provide a lot of services for our kids. And then when a kid gets to 5 or 6 years old and enter the schools also end up doing, sometimes for a lot of kids, different social services. Why we have these two silos and can't bring some of that together and reduce some cost expense on local school budgets and be more efficient by blending those services and making them more available to kids in every town at their local school instead of 30 miles away at some center, is an area where I think we can also help local schools then have more opportunity for teachers to be teachers and be creative and really expand on what they do as teachers. But a lot of that is around all of us as a state, because the human services is a state function, really looking out for everybody for that chance to succeed and taking some of that, quote, burden off of the local schools. That isn't specific to Act 46 and some of the mergers, but I think it might also relieve some of the pressure that you're facing that led to some of these challenges and may lead to some of those new formed districts pushing for schools to close. I don't know if that's going too far afield, but I just kind of wanted to throw that out there as part of the conversation. I know someone else talked about healthcare. You know, if we had a universal healthcare system, then that whole contract negotiations and price negotiations and so forth could be about salaries and schedules and just take healthcare right out of the equation. There are a lot of other pieces that it's just really hard for citizen school boards to cope with in all of the negotiation process, and really what you want to be focusing on is how do we get the best education for our kids. But I'm open to a lot of other suggestions and ideas.
So definitely we had a lot of comments about healthcare costs, so appreciate you bringing that up. One other piece about sort of what it means to have the best schools for our kids is as we look to the future of Vermont, a lot of comments about how our community schools are really what makes us so special and what makes Vermont so special and something that is thriving in a lot of communities that we should continue to invest in. So wondering about, David, as you look to the future of Vermont, whether that's through COVID, post-COVID, wherever we are in the pandemic, what do our resilient, brilliant, special schools bring to that?
Well, in some ways, as we've dealt with COVID, we've learned, some of the smaller schools may be better suited for the COVID world because you have fewer, instead of having, the high school my daughter is in, I think has 1,600 kids. And, even if they split into two hybrid model halves, so there's 800 kids per half, there's a lot more people to potentially transmit and then far more vectors out into society. Whereas in a smaller community school, that's just it's a smaller zone of infection opportunity. So I think in many ways, the small schools are maybe going to be rekindled and re-supported by the realities of COVID. And then the other thing is, as a reality of COVID, is these people from all over the country, but particularly southern New England and New York, suddenly buying and moving into Vermont in all kinds of ways to come to this safe place. And I think there's going to be a lot of challenges as people that move here without really fully feeling everything else that's involved in being a community member in these small towns coming from bigger places. But integrating those families into our schools, I think, is a good thing. It will actually help with some of the population issues and some of the tax rate issues that were driving some of the challenges. But I think we have real opportunities with COVID to then say, okay, what if we also were to invest in affordable, efficient housing in our towns and village centers so that we could both try to create jobs in construction, create village centers with a critical mass to support local, local stores and coffee shops and so forth. And I would argue we should also include expanding broadband in our rural communities so more people could live and work in their town, which means they also would be available to be a volunteer in the school instead of driving 40 miles away to work when you couldn't for 2 hours take a moment, go be in your school to volunteer for something. So to me, part of the vision of the future is rebuilding a more localized school and community sense. And that's going to take a lot of different factors coming together. But I think for those of you that really support and value your small schools, it's that key local community value and resiliency that you've come up with mutual aid groups right now. Your schools, in some instances, were places where meals were made and distributed from. And so they really are a community center far beyond just an academic place or a place to put kids while adults have the opportunity to go to work. We need to stop thinking of schools as sort of advanced childcare so we can work as adults, but in fact, as community centers and future adult, socializing, supporting structures.
So I'm wondering from folks in the room, more ideas about this phenomenon of the community schools or strengthening the school's place in the community, whether that's adding other services or what it would take to add new people to our community so more kids are going there. What would that look like for people in your own communities? We have some comments about making class sizes larger.
And I'm reading one of those right now, and I can say I was in a pretty big district when I was growing up, but my second and third grade class was half second graders and half third graders with the same teacher for 2 years. And it was a really interesting model because the third graders were also learning to be helpers in some ways with the second graders. And so there were different ways of learning responsibility and community support and individual support peer-to-peer at a very young age, which I think had some foundational impacts on me, both in terms of multi-age and intergenerational. I mean, obviously 1 year apart isn't intergenerational, although when you're 7 and 8, it is a 12% difference.
Lifetime.
That's
Yeah.
right. But you also learn some different responsibilities. And, I think learning responsibilities is pretty important too.
I see a lot of people talking about affordable housing.
Does somebody want to chime in a little bit
I'm
about
wondering,
affordable
Liz,
housing?
Liz Adams, you have your hand up and you had a comment about housing. So I'm wondering if you want to jump in.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who are interested in moving into our school district, one in Southeast, but housing is not affordable for people with moderate incomes. And I think that's where Vermont is really hitting the wall. A lot of people want to move here, don't want to rent. They want to buy a home. But housing prices are through the roof and have been for a number of years. And I think it would be, I don't know if it would be better done on a local level or a state level, but it seems like the USDA could be partnered with to buy the land and build the housing that people with moderate income can afford. And now with all these prefab companies that have sprung up and the energy efficiency they're building into their models, it makes that a really affordable option. So I don't know if that would be something the state could really, really encourage. In Putney, we basically, our village center is all built up. So now we have to, if we want to build houses for people to buy, we have to move out of the village center. There's no question about that. But yet our town plan is problematic in that sense.
So I hear you saying affordable housing, shifts to the town plan, ways of partnering, whether between the town and the state and maybe someone else.
Well, the USDA offers mortgages to people with moderate incomes. And so to me, that would be your go-to place. That's how I kept my house all these years. As
governor, what role do you think you'd have? Liz, I'm sorry. I think our timing is a moment off from each other, so I keep on interrupting you by accident.
That's okay.
David, I'm wondering, as governor, what do you see as a path forward to really expand our housing opportunity?
Yeah, I think first a little bit of context, which is that it's always interesting when I hear from some political figures saying, everyone's going to move out of the state, everyone's moving out of the state, and yet we also have this incredible housing pressure because people want to move into the state. So there's this dichotomy of rhetoric and reality, but it's also true that particularly sort of the middle band, middle class folks are really where it's stuck because they're at a point where they want to buy, but the price of housing is just too high relative to the wages. And those folks, some are moving out. There's no doubt about it. And this is where I always find the rub sort of curious, because of course the price of housing is related to supply and demand. And we are in the New England market, particularly those of you in Southern Vermont, where folks are selling homes in the Boston area or Connecticut or New York. And what they sell versus what they can buy here is night and day in terms of size of house and land. And so they can buy things that seem cheap to them and they're expensive to us. And so to me, that's why we have a role in government, which is to say, all right, the rules of supply and demand don't work with these economic dynamics of what the wages are in Vermont versus the wages in these other places, even though we're in the same housing shed, to use a sort of water term. So then what do we do? And I've talked now for a couple of years about a Green Mountain New Deal, where with the Trump tax cuts, we could look to the top 5% or so of Vermonters, those making over $250,000, to in the short term, instead of just accepting all of the Trump tax cut and it going to Washington, if we were to sequester about half of that, we would have between $80 and $110 million a year for a few years to put into affordable housing, broadband, weatherization of older housing that are often occupied by low-income folks and or fixed-income seniors, to really address some of those affordability issues where those who are in homes, they could lower their utility bills and we could tackle the climate crisis. And for those where we need more housing and where the town plan, and again, that goes back to local control issues, could offer, hey, if you build denser housing, smaller scale, more efficient, you could allow for that to happen. Maybe the state could be supportive with affordable housing grants or supports to developers to build that housing and create more units, which is fundamentally what's going to drive some of the supply and demand. We might as well do it in a way that fits with the goals of, I think, many communities. It's a hard call because a lot of people want the independence to say, well, I want a house on my own 3, 7, or 20 acres. But that is a challenge, both in terms of how many of those acres are there and the climate concern, where we drive more per capita than almost any other state in the country because we are so spread out. So if communities want to make sure there's more housing and more affordable housing, they might need to look towards some zoning issues that allow for some density, and then we could subsidize and support that with perpetual affordable housing grants and supports, so that we create more opportunity for those folks in those working class, middle income situations to either stay or move in.
Thanks. Want to name another opportunity that's on here that sometimes it feels like it goes without saying, but it's important to say: broadband on the list. And so you're welcome to comment on that. We also have a number of questions about data and data-driven decision-making and what affordable even means for schools and how we know if Act 46 is working or not. And that's a little bit of a pivot, but I think it's an important thing to spend a moment on.
Sure. A couple of different things. One is I don't have data and numbers right now to talk about what is or isn't working in Act 46, and I'm open to anybody reaching out with either why it's hard to get that data or that the data exists and I just haven't seen it. Any one of those things are possible. So I can't really remark right now with respect to that. The other thing is, when there are savings in some districts, they then add a foreign language or they add an art class. And so the savings are hard to sort of quantify and pin down, but they've created opportunities in certain circumstances. In other places, that may not be the case. And I'm sure each of you who has knowledge in some of these arenas can offer me, quote, counter arguments or facts that might back up that there isn't the savings that were expected and that there are just more vice supervisors and so forth that are eating up all the money that was supposed to be saved. And some of that goes back to what are all the hoops and what are all the burdens that are being put on schools with respect to rules and regulations from the state or the federal level. And that's something worth talking about, but it's hard when you want to make sure kids are getting certain opportunities. As a state, people want to make sure that certain groups of folks are legally, get their rights to a certain education. There are limits to sort of how much that can be opened up under sort of Constitution and equal rights clauses. But some of the districts do this more cost effectively than others, and we need to go around the state and look at what those best ways are and help offer consultation, not mandate down what people should be or could be doing to save some money and advance opportunities. Because also the other thing is, each district rarely has the opportunity or time to go, what's happening over there and what's happening over there? And if we had better opportunities for that, I think that is a role the state could play to help with information and not force some things down throats. But there's added administrative costs in districts as more and more things like No Child Left Behind and other quantifying measures are placed on teachers and schools that don't really define success, but they are metrics that are put in place by politicians to say, see, we're holding everyone accountable. And sometimes the cost of accountability is greater than the cost of a little bit of loss that would free up resources to be teaching or educating.
Thanks. I appreciate what you said about the agency of education, the possibility of it having a consulting role and a technical assistance role and a connector role and a really bringing out the best in each of the school districts.
But Emily, I have to say, education agency has had huge cuts for the last 5 or 10 years. The number of personnel there has been slashed and burned. And when you hear comments like no new taxes and we can fit within our means, and we've cut human services positions that would have been used for things like COVID tracing, and we had to retrain other people. We've seen cuts in the agency of education. We see cuts and cuts and cuts in all the agencies across state government. And then people say, government isn't working well enough. So government is bad. I mean, it's this self-fulfilling prophecy as the rhetoric comes down to never fund what the state could do in that advisory role and in an informative role.
3 cheers for that. So another big role for the state and a possible opportunity for schools is other ways to support families with young children. So we have some folks talking about just the high cost of having a kid. And I know you know that, and I know that. I think most of the people on the call know about that. And so questions about the cost of higher ed, we've talked about health insurance already, and then a few people talking about early care and education, the pre-public school years, and the costs and the challenges around that.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of different issues there. And I know that some folks feel like a lot of early pre-K slots have disappeared because of the, again, guidance and mandates from the state to say, well, you need to be sure you have, you know, these parameters of safety for the kids or ratios of age of kids to instructors, and that's made it too expensive. And so then you have this, again, this challenge of saying, well, just plunking a bunch of kids in a room isn't really childcare or early pre-K. How do we make sure kids are getting access to a little more stimulation, but then that costs money? And so to me, a lot of this goes back to healthcare again. I've heard from a lot of childcare providers that when they're offering people, you know, $11, $50, $12, $13 an hour, but no health insurance, they just find other jobs, or they work for a year and go to another job because they need health insurance. So when I think about the conversation around healthcare and the challenges we face in implementing it, because people think it'll cost this or it'll cost that, we have to look at this other side of what kind of stability could be created where people could work if they in a job for longer than a year or two, if they knew they always had healthcare coverage, and what that would do for pre-K and childcare issues. I see Joyce's comment, so we'll try there. But some of these things are related in that costs are bearing down on everybody. It's cost in healthcare. It's cost in healthcare and education. It's costs that people are concerned about taxes, and so they want the accountability. Then the accountability drives administrative costs. The administrative costs take away from teaching time in the schools. Then you get this pressure to shrink budgets, and then you get pressure to create Act 46. So, Joyce, I don't want to dismiss what you're saying. I do think we could come back to more directly Act 46 and merge districts. But sometimes, and one of the things I would do as governor is break down the silos on these conversations, just like I said earlier with human services and education. Because if we just think about the issue right in front of us and not how it relates to the others, or the others relate and put pressure, we end up with that. I did put out a proposal a week ago to create about a $40 million funding source for money for pre-K, because we know that quality pre-K costs money. And folks can go to my website to find out more about that and think about that or reach out, because I think that too would free up parents to be part of the workforce again. And being part of the workforce will help with economic circumstances and affordability and the ability to pay taxes and so forth. So all of these things are quite interrelated.
And I agree that, you know, in addition to sort of the financial pressure around schools that led to a lot of this, I think what we've heard from folks in the chat today is that some of the schools felt a real pressure because they were smaller schools and they were having declining enrollment. And so we're seeing an increase in enrollment lately, and we were talking about policy proposals to sort of continue that increase in enrollment to, you know, keep our schools at the center of our communities. And we have a little one with us today to talk about it all. Hello, Joanna's little person. So as we're closing up, would love to hear from you, sort of the final word on Act 46 as we're closing up, and then really what you see as the role of next governor, if you are the next governor, when you are the next governor, I hope, what you see as your vision for the future.
Well, a couple things. I know I've gotten questions about whether the quote loophole should be closed, and I don't think it's a loophole, and I don't think it should be closed. That if all the towns in a district vote to break a district, they should be allowed to do so. I don't think that's going to be the savior for many of these situations, because all it takes is one town to not vote to break up for it not to succeed. But I don't think that should be closed. B, I think we need to really look at whether the state can be involved in making sure each prior small district and small school area at least has a voice in and a veto voice in closing their school. C, I think we need to invest in affordable housing in our small towns and villages, and especially also broadband, so that we can do some repopulating, which would bring more kids into these districts, which would help with some of the critical mass for some of those cost efficiency issues. And D, I would at least entertain the conversation of what happened when mergers were forced on districts that had done the work and presented the numbers and the facts that they shouldn't have been forced to merge, as was the intent of Act 46. Now, it may well be that over time, some of those that were unhappy about merging are going to be okay with the new merged districts, but in other places, maybe not. Oh, there's another little one. Thanks, Joyce and Joanna. It's the J Crew with little ones that we do have at least conversations. I can't right now promise you we'll just wave this away, because I do think there are pressures around the state, but we have to look at these other pressures that are also driving costs, so that you have the ability to keep your districts open, keep your school operating well, being the creative schools and community schools that you are. And I think there's a lot of folks that do value that. And there's times when the state goes too far, and we need to figure that out.